Oh my God.
I found the ring in his sock drawer 8 months before I ever saw his face on that stadium screen. I told myself it was for me. I told myself a lot of things that year, and I believed almost none of them. But I said them out loud anyway, because saying them out loud felt safer than asking the one question that actually mattered. That night, folding his laundry on our bed while the World Cup played quietly in the background, I was not looking for anything. I was just tired, and the television was just noise. Until the camera panned across a crowd of people in a stadium 4,000 miles away and stopped on a jacket I had bought for him myself 2 Christmases ago. I did not scream. I did not drop anything. I sat completely still and watched the man I was supposed to marry get down on one knee in front of a stranger, pull a ring out of his pocket, and ask her the exact question he had asked me 2 years earlier, in the exact same voice, with what looked like the exact same amount of feeling behind it, which was somehow the worst part of all. Not the betrayal itself, but how easy it clearly was for him. How rehearsed. How many times had he practiced that voice before he ever used it on me? For 3 years, I had believed I understood the shape of his life. His job took him away often, and I had built a version of myself that did not ask too many questions about airports and hotel rooms, because asking too many questions felt like the kind of thing insecure women did, and I did not want to be that woman. I wanted to be the woman who trusted her partner. I have since learned there is a very fine line between trust and simply refusing to look, and for 3 years I was standing right on top of that line without knowing it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What I did not know that night, sitting frozen on our bed with a laundry basket still in my lap, was that the ring on that stranger's finger was not the one he told me he had lost 18 months earlier at a work conference. It was not new. It was old. It had a very specific, very small flaw in the setting that I recognized instantly, because I was the one standing next to him when he chose it, back when he was choosing it for me. He had told me it slipped off his finger at a hotel pool and was never found. I had cried about that ring more than I ever admitted to him, because some small part of me had understood, even then, that losing it meant something. I just did not know what. His name was Preston Cade, and by every outward measure he was exactly the man I thought I was building a life with. Steady job in sports marketing, good with my family, remembered small details about my day that most people forget. The kind of man my mother pointed to as proof that decent men still existed. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story about spotting a monster from a mile away. This is a story about a man who was, by every visible measure, kind, right up until the moment 3 years of quiet inconsistencies collapsed into a single unbearable image on a television screen in front of millions of strangers who had no idea they were watching my life fall apart in real time. My sister Dana was the only person who ever said anything out loud. Not accusations, nothing that dramatic, just small comments over the years that I brushed aside because they were inconvenient. She once said his trips felt oddly specific for someone who claimed not to enjoy travel. She once asked why a man in sports marketing was gone for entire tournaments rather than single weekends. I told her she was reading too much into a job she did not understand, and she let it go, because that is what people do when you insist you are fine. They believe you, even when some part of them does not, because it is easier than fighting you on it. What I did not tell Dana, because I had not fully admitted it to myself, was that 6 months before that broadcast, I found a second phone in the inside pocket of a jacket he rarely wore. It was locked. I told myself everyone is entitled to some privacy, that a second phone did not automatically mean anything was wrong, and I put it back exactly where I found it and never mentioned it again. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I have had to sit with it since. I had physical evidence in my hands, and I chose comfort over the truth, because the truth, at that point, would have cost me everything I thought I had already built. The broadcast lasted maybe 11 seconds before the camera moved on to something else. A wide shot of the crowd, celebrating a goal I did not even register. 11 seconds to end 3 years. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should rewind it, as though this were a recording and not a live international broadcast being watched by an audience larger than the population of most countries. I remember reaching for my phone with hands that did not feel like mine, opening social media, and finding the clip already there, already being shared, already captioned by strangers who had no idea the woman it would eventually reach was sitting 40 minutes from the airport he claimed to be flying out of for business. He told me it was a business trip, sponsorship meetings, he said, the kind of unglamorous work travel nobody wants to hear about at dinner parties. I had made him a sandwich for the flight 2 mornings earlier. I had kissed him at the door and told him to be safe. I had spent that entire week planning a small anniversary dinner for when he came home, because our anniversary fell 3 days after his return date, and I wanted it to be perfect, because some quiet, stubborn part of me still believed that if I just made everything perfect enough, none of my unspoken suspicions could possibly be true. I am telling you all of this not because I want your sympathy, though I will not pretend it does not help, but because I think somewhere in this story is a version of a question a lot of women ask themselves and never say out loud. How much of what we call trust is actually just fear of what we might find if we looked closer? I looked away for 3 years. That night, whether I wanted to or not, I was finally forced to look, and what I found underneath that 11-second broadcast was so much more complicated, and so much worse, than a man simply falling in love with someone else. Because the woman on that screen, the one saying yes with tears in her eyes to a proposal she had no reason to doubt, was about to become the second person in this story that Preston Cade had lied to. And she had absolutely no idea that somewhere back home, another woman was sitting frozen on a bed, with a laundry basket in her lap, holding a phone with a viral video already spreading across it, about to become the reason both of their lives came apart within the same 48 hours. There were 3 questions I needed answered before I could even think about what to do next. Who was this woman, and how long had she actually been part of his life? Was the business trip cover story something he built on the spot? Or had he been rehearsing this exact lie for months, maybe longer? And underneath both of those, the question I was almost afraid to ask myself: if a man could hide an entire second relationship in plain sight for years, what else about the last 3 years of my life had never actually been real? I did not have those answers yet. What I had was a laundry basket, a phone full of comments from strangers, and a sister who was already in her car, driving over before I even finished the sentence explaining what had happened. To understand how a man builds a life good enough to fool the people closest to him, you have to go back to the beginning, because none of this started with a lie. It started, like most of these stories do, with something that felt completely ordinary. I met Preston through mutual friends at a housewarming party, and what I remember most is that he was the only person in the room who asked me a second question after my answer, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk again. That small thing mattered more than it should have. We dated slowly, carefully, the way 2 people do when they have both been burned before and are trying not to repeat old mistakes. For the first year, there was nothing about him that gave me any reason to look twice. His job in sports marketing was the thing that eventually shaped almost everything about our life together, including, I now understand, the architecture of his other life. He worked with brands that sponsored major tournaments, which meant travel was simply part of the deal, and I built my entire understanding of normal around that fact. When he proposed to me 2 years into the relationship, it was on a quiet weekend trip, nothing extravagant, just the 2 of us, and a ring he told me he had saved for carefully. I said yes without a single doubt in my mind. My mother cried. My sister hugged him longer than she hugged me. Nobody in that room could have told you a single reason to worry about the years ahead of us. Looking back now, I can trace a handful of moments I dismissed at the time, small enough on their own that none of them felt like evidence of anything, but impossible to ignore once you line them up end to end. A canceled video call with an excuse that did not quite match the timeline he had given me earlier that day. A hotel reservation confirmation email I glimpsed once on his laptop screen, made out for 2 guests instead of 1, which he explained away as a work colleague sharing costs. A name mentioned once at a dinner with his co-workers, Vanessa, said quickly and moved past just as quickly, the way people do when a name is not supposed to land anywhere. I let all of it land nowhere, because I had already decided what kind of relationship I was in, and I did not want new information that might contradict it. 2 weeks before the trip that ended everything, I found a boarding pass tucked into the pocket of a suitcase we rarely used, dated months earlier, for a destination he had never once mentioned to me. I remember standing in our closet holding that piece of paper for a long time, running through every possible innocent explanation I could think of, and finding, if I am honest, that none of them fully worked. I put the boarding pass back exactly where I found it. I told myself I would ask him about it eventually, when the timing felt right. The timing never felt right, because some part of me understood that asking the question out loud would force me to actually hear the answer. When he announced this particular trip, framed as one more routine sponsorship assignment tied to the World Cup, nothing about his explanation stood out as unusual on its own. What stood out was everything around it. A new suitcase he bought without mentioning it until it was already in the hallway. A haircut 2 days before departure that felt oddly deliberate for a man who usually put off haircuts for weeks past when he needed one. A phone he suddenly kept face down on every surface. A habit he had never had before that week. None of these things proved anything by themselves, and I want to be honest that even as I noticed each one, I kept building explanations that let me avoid the obvious pattern forming in front of me. The night of the broadcast, Dana had come over for what was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the two of us half watching the opening match while I finished folding laundry, and she scrolled through her phone on the couch. Neither of us was paying close attention until the broadcast cut to a wide shot of the crowd during a break in play, and I saw the jacket before I saw his face, because I had bought that jacket myself, and some part of my brain recognized it faster than the rest of me could process what I was actually looking at. By the time my mind caught up to what my eyes were seeing, he was already on one knee, and a woman I had never met in my life was already crying and nodding yes in front of a camera being broadcast to an audience larger than most countries. What followed that night was not a single conversation but an entire investigation Dana and I built together over the course of about 6 hours, sitting at my kitchen table with 2 laptops and every account we could access between us. We started with the credit card statements and found charges for a shared apartment I had never heard of, paid through a business account under a company name that did not match anything I recognized from his actual job. We found a second phone bill, tied to a number that matched the voicemail he had once left on my phone by accident months earlier, which I had dismissed at the time as a wrong number rather than what it actually was. A mistake he made calling the wrong woman. Before we landed on Vanessa's name with any certainty, Dana and I spent nearly 2 hours chasing a completely different theory, one that felt, at the time, almost more believable than the truth. A string of unfamiliar charges from a downtown accounting firm led us to briefly suspect that Preston's real secret had nothing to do with another woman at all, and everything to do with money quietly moving out of accounts I did not know existed. We built an entire theory around a coworker named Rachel, whose name appeared repeatedly on shared calendar invitations, convinced for a short, frantic stretch that she was somehow at the center of whatever he had been hiding. It took a single phone call to Rachel herself, confused and mildly alarmed to be woken up at midnight, to clear her name entirely and send us back to the beginning, with less time and considerably less patience than we started with. It was a reverse image search, of all things, that finally connected the woman from the broadcast to an actual name. Dana pulled a still frame from the viral clip and ran it against public event photos from tournament sponsorship functions, the kind of gatherings Preston's job had always given him a plausible reason to attend. Vanessa's face appeared in the background of a photo from an event nearly a year earlier, tagged by a public relations account, standing 2 feet away from a man whose face had been cropped out of the frame entirely. Deliberately or not, I still do not know. That cropped-out space told me almost as much as her name did. There was a moment that night when I genuinely believed Vanessa might be as much a victim in this as I was, an unwitting participant in a lie she had no way of detecting from her side of it. And I want to say now that this instinct turned out to be correct, though it took real evidence to confirm it. Marcus Webb, Preston's business partner, was the person who eventually gave us that confirmation, though not willingly. Dana found his number through Preston's old email threads. And when I called him that night, his answers were short, evasive, clearly protecting someone, right up until I told him the video had already been viewed by more than 4 million people and was not going away no matter how carefully anyone tried to manage it from this point forward. Marcus finally admitted what he knew 2 days later, sitting across from me in a coffee shop he chose specifically because it was far from anywhere either of us usually went. Preston and Vanessa's relationship had started over a year earlier, but the reason behind it was more complicated than simple attraction. Vanessa's family held real influence with the tournament's sponsorship board, and Preston's position at his firm had been quietly at risk for longer than I ever knew. Marcus told me, with what looked like genuine discomfort, that Preston had pursued Vanessa at least in part because of what her family connections could do for his career, and that somewhere in the middle of that calculation, whatever he told himself about his feelings for her had gotten tangled up with what he needed from her family, until even Marcus was not certain Preston himself could separate the two anymore. I called Preston that same afternoon, before he had any idea the broadcast had already reached home, before he understood that the woman he left behind for a business trip now knew exactly what kind of business had actually taken place. His voice on the phone went through every stage I imagine most people go through when they are caught this completely, this publicly. Confusion first, then a clumsy, halting attempt to explain something that had no reasonable explanation, then finally something close to panic when he understood that this was not a conversation he could talk his way out of, because the evidence was not something I was accusing him of, it was something 4 million strangers had already watched with their own eyes. Vanessa was the harder call to make, not because I felt any obligation toward her, but because some part of me needed to know for certain whether she had known about me the entire time. When I finally reached her, 2 days after the broadcast, it became clear within the first few minutes that she had genuinely believed Preston was free to propose to her. She had no idea I existed. She described a version of him I recognized immediately, careful about details, generous with attention, exactly the man I had once described to my own friends in the earliest years of our relationship. Hearing her describe him that way was strange in a way I still do not fully have words for, like listening to someone tell you your own story with different names attached to it. What happened next surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. Vanessa called off her own engagement within days of learning the truth, and rather than disappearing from my life the way I expected, she reached out to me directly, first through a short message, then eventually through an actual phone call that lasted almost 2 hours. 2 women who had never met, both deceived by the same man in different ways, ended up comparing notes on a man neither of us wanted anything more to do with. I will not pretend that conversation resolved every complicated feeling I had toward her, but I can tell you it resolved far more than I expected it to. Preston lost far more than either of us did in the end, though I take no particular satisfaction in saying that. Once the sponsorship board and his own firm understood the full scope of what had happened, tied directly to a scandal that had already been viewed by millions of people across multiple platforms, the professional relationships he had built his entire plan around collapsed almost as quickly as our engagement did. The very connections he had been trying to secure through Vanessa's family became the reason his career took the hardest hit of all, because no sponsor wants their name anywhere near a story this public, this humiliating, this thoroughly documented on video for anyone to find. I think about trust differently now than I did before any of this happened. I used to believe trust meant giving someone the benefit of every doubt, no matter how many small inconsistencies accumulated along the way. I understand now that real trust requires being willing to ask the uncomfortable question and actually listen to the answer, even when part of you already suspects you will not like what you hear. I spent 3 years protecting a version of my relationship that only existed because I refused to look closely enough to see it clearly. I am not telling you this story so you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this story because I suspect at least some of you watching have looked away from something too, and I think it is worth asking yourselves tonight what you might already know, if you finally let yourself look. So here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. If the woman your partner betrayed you with turns out to be someone he deceived, just as thoroughly as he deceived you, does that change how you see her? Or does it just confirm that a man like that was never capable of being honest with anyone at all? I would genuinely like to know what you think, because I am still working out my own answer. If this story affected you the way it affected me while I lived through it, stay close, because there is another story coming that I think you are going to want to hear from the very beginning.